And I just want to introduce to those who haven't been with us yesterday our 4 keynote speakers. We have Lara Putnam, Paul Kramer, Manu Gusami, and Andrew Zimmerman. And I am now going to sit here.
So we're supposed to, we
You see, this is exactly faithful to the moments of experience yesterday.
You thought you were exempt.
yeah. I mean, someone said like the jazz, like the free jazz.
Free
jazz,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
like the jazz standard. So like, I'll call out the two, like it's called the head and jazz. So like the tune is narrative. Let's talk about narrative. No, or not. Let's talk about writing. Or whatever we want to talk about.
Creative tension. See, we made it look so easy.
Could we talk about scale?
Yeah.
Okay. So just, I don't have a lot of very coherent thoughts on this, but just 2 things. I think the scale question is obviously really interesting, and obviously, as somebody pointed out yesterday, some of those debates come out of geography, and then of course in history they are inflected slightly differently. But I have, against my own past training, begun to worry a little bit when debates hunker down too much on methodological questions, rather than so there's the problem of thinking that if we solve the question of scale, then all our other substantive problems of how do you mediate levels of analysis, how do you mediate between forms of universality and forms of particularity, how do you mediate all of these other kind of substantive epistemological questions disappear. And I think there is no scalar fix, in other words. It doesn't matter. There is, it's not the nation, it's not the region, it's not the global, and like that. So that's one sort of general sort of kind of thing. The other thing I think is that in some ways, the best kind of geography literature I thought was arguing about was an exhortation towards deeper historicization, right? That the problem was not that things weren't geographical enough. The problem was that those scales hadn't been historicized, right? So you weren't thinking about the historical geographies that produced particular historical geographies, in other words, right? Okay. One way I think, and I thought it was interesting that you spoke about communism, as you did, and contra and communism, and I did. This was a conspiracy. No, it wasn't. It was like, and then everybody will think it's a thing, and it's like, it's a thing. It's like, this is how you build a thing. And of course it's not a thing. But there is something about I think Lara brought this up as well, about the kind of, some of the global connective histories have been, the ones that particularly have been driven by, say, digital stuff, or under the umbrella of connective history. There's a kind of danger of a kind of synchronization, right? So you're just putting together points of connection, and what gets lost are the multiple temporalities, so the long durée, the short term, the kind of contingency. This is the stuff historians do, right? So this is the stuff that they are, thinking about the historical temporalization of a particular phenomenon or a category. So I think that we need to think about scale also as a temporal question. And particularly, I think something underrepresented in global history still is kind of histories of politics, which are, so not political histories, but a history of politics, right? And that distinction in the ways in which that's worked out in global history. And so, something I realize is that as I kind of get, at least this second project, which is much more about a kind of history of politics, necessarily required greater engagement with questions of temporality, just because it is precisely that. So I think, in other words, there is no method that can be worked out before the question is formulated, in other words. Yeah. So I guess that's.
Can I ask something about this?
Yes.
Because it seems to connect you know, you started out thinking maybe we'll talk about narratives. So maybe you will talk about narratives. Scale, is there a tension between scale and coherence? You know, thinking that historians are researchers and analysts, you know, and theorists in some ways, but also storytellers, right? So maybe you could talk a bit about the challenges of, yeah, you know, you want to get to all these places, you want to think about these different scales. Are you thinking about a readership that needs to still come out with, you know, something that would have the rules of not necessarily like a nicely trimmed narrative, but do you feel there's a challenge in making all these scales work in a way that would still be kind of a symphony? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've become more interested in the storytelling aspect. I mean, I've always been interested in it, but for the current project, writing a story, and partly because it's a story that, like, the Civil War is like a genre practically. It's just like a thing that lots of, and so I think challenging the old other stories it's almost like a replacement story or like maybe a displacement story. And I think there's a way in which narrative history can like kind of make everything seem the same. It's like just like another story, and you know, and you have like whatever, the weather's always some particular way on some particular day, and then someone does something. It's all kind of like generic and interchangeable in a way. And so I think one of the reasons I'm interested in writing history now is to try to think about ways of narrative that are not. I think a lot of narrative history gets banal in ways it doesn't have to be at all. And I think de-banalizing narrative or de-narrativizing. I mean, there's a Dominic LeCapra, I'm sure he wrote it up somewhere, this was a talk long ago, but he said, you know, history and literature emerged at about the same time in the 19th century, and literature, you know, you would definitely know whether a novel or a short story was written in, not just whether it was written in the 20th century, the 21st century, the 19th century, whether it was written in like 1850 or 1890 or whatever. And history, you'd also know that, but that the narrative form is much more unchanging. And we still are kind of writing, you know, oftentimes when you write narrative history, writing kind of 19th century realist fiction, and we have so many more realist nonfiction. But we have so many more resources from literature, and we can continue to borrow from them. So, and I mean, it's a kind of history that's written as a novel. I don't think that's exactly the right thing either, because you do have to be true to your own form too. But I think I'm really interested in ways of experimenting. And so, like, to go back to the scale question, I know we're not supposed to like Bruno Latour anymore because it's like me, and I accept a lot of those criticisms, but I still think that network model, if one takes into account that like some networks are not, and it's not all a smooth single network, but there's a way that lends itself very well to storytelling. I think that's something that I like, and thinking about the scale of the narrative as opposed to the scale of the thing we're writing about.
Yeah, picking up on that point, I mean, I think there is a lot of room for experiment in narrative form to make it do this multi-scalar work that we want, and I do think it involves both conceptual and kind of historical reimagining, but also, you know, kind of sentence construction, thinking about how to put sentences together that can encompass these various scales. And I think, yeah, Laura, you had a point about, you know, a way of narrating that story in ways that, you know, simultaneously brought readers into these scales simultaneously. And I think part of the pedagogical work of a text like that is that it also can help readers get a sense of the multi-scalar character of their own lives, right? Mm-hmm. In the way of narrating that, it becomes a way that people's contemporary social imaginaries can expand, right? In terms of thinking about things that they didn't necessarily see as having a causal impact on them because of its seeming remoteness actually are, right? So I think there's an important kind of meta-level form of education beyond simply the content of what we're trying to convey, is this broader way of thinking both about history and the present.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would say the one important caution I would sort of add back in is the point that Manu started us off with, which is the risk of losing time depth if you choose a narrative that's going to allow you to show the connections in the present. So sometimes I think I was for a while trying hard to come up with a term for the thing that people were talking about as transnational history, but that wouldn't be called transnational history because transnational had become like identity in the 1990s, and it meant everything to everyone, and so it was not a helpful word because it didn't communicate. So, and the most, the best tagline I came up with for what people were trying to think really hard about transnational history, including everyone who's sitting up here other than me, what people were trying to do was like a spatially intentional, multi-scalar, problem-driven history. So spatially intentional in the sense of eschewing very intentionally methodological nationalism and saying part of the first and ongoing step of my research praxis is going to be to establish which places were connected when, and that moves over time. There's not a single answer to that. And there's also not a single answer because it depends in regard to what. So that's why it has to be problem-driven history for there to be any kind of coherent answer to the question of which places were most connected. Well, so what I'm interested in is, cotton exports, that's going to be one thing. If I'm interested in love letters, it might look the same, but it might look different, and there needs to be some intentionality to the decisions that I'm making so that the logic says then, there's a problem that I'm focusing on, I try to reconstruct what would have been the places that were most relevant to the circuits of capital or labor or commodities moving up, and that is necessarily going to require me to look at a deeper history for some of those. And then that will be the space that maps out the geography of intended search within which I will look for the sources I need to reconstruct the process that I'm interested in so that I can tell a multi-scalar history, but trying to push myself to separate out or to be aware of the establishment of the terrain of study as being itself requiring research, and also being sort of needing to be continually adjusted, not just in service to the narrative not just in service to the narrative hook, not just in service to like the one life that it was so cool that I wanted to tell, but also with the sort of self-correction of being forced to say, okay, but even without that hook, should Goa have been in there or not? Do I need to pay attention to that place, or is there somewhere else that I'm leaving out that would have been so important for anyone living at that time that I really need to be attentive to where that would have come into the story, or what I should be looking for there?
I mean, when following up on that, I think one of the challenges is a lot of what we end up doing, I think, in this kind of work ends up being recontextualizing, right? And rescaling things that somebody else has studied in some other context, right? But so we're actually doing a kind of meta-level connective work between secondary literatures that have not spoken to each other, right? And so I think part of the challenge there is realizing that even once we have things moving, right? We have historical agents interacting across these distances. It requires us to have enough of a deep knowledge of those historiographies that we understand the way that national or regional frameworks were wired into the interpretive frameworks themselves, right? Because I feel like it's not just about, I feel like sometimes we satisfy ourselves by tracking influences or movements or things like we can, that's how we identify we have a transnational thing, right? But without really digging down into the originary historiographies and what they may have included, right? So there's a kind of unwiring from national historiographies that has to happen simultaneously with the rewiring of history across these new scales. And I feel like that's, in a way, one of the real challenges, because that involves having that kind of historiographic depth in more than one field, right? As opposed to, the kind of digital parachuting in that you were talking about.
Laura, I thought in your talk, when you talked about building historiography back in, I think was the phrase you used. I think that's a useful way to think about what you were both just talking about, of like kind of it's sort of finding building your archive, I was imagining it as kind of a circle, like building the historiography back in, then coming to new sources and building it back in. And I think that, for me, that was a very useful metaphor for thinking about what we do.
Yeah, and I think it both reminds us it's both important to do because of we need to know enough about the existing historiography to know its patterned weaknesses. But I think one of the things that historians traditionally have done really well and yet never noticed that we do is learn to read secondary sources with the same critical eye that we read primary sources in a way that makes everyone in this room, I'm sure, is a reasonably sophisticated consumer of secondary sources of historiography. And I was struck by this because I have a friend who's not a historian and totally brilliant person who's now like dabbling in writing, trying to write a historical, a work of history. And so she had picked up some work of 19th century US history of science. And it was the most bizarre conversation because the things that she was worried about were just things that I wouldn't have noticed about this book. And she was noticing the weak things about the book, but not because she was like doing a grad school critique, because she was trying to figure out like what she needed information about a certain thing, but she was worried about the fact that there was this thing that seemed very distorted, and so I realized as we talked, it was like can I rely on this piece of basically, you know, empirical reconstruction of the, you know, timing of the telegraph, because it seems like this author is really weird because they keep going on about this other stuff that is in a paradigm that seems a really non-persuasive reading of gender. And I realized that I, as a historian, would be like, you know, not because I'm super special, but because I would have, the things that I would have looked at would have been like, who published this, in what year, and I would already have been, I would have controlled for the poor theory of gender, because I would just be like, oh yeah, well so that was like the 1970s, and it was published in such and such a place. So here's the stuff I'm not gonna, that is not where I would go for a theory of gender. I'm gonna like, but I'm also not gonna discount the other stuff, because actually that kind of, you know, like, let's say hypothetically it was like a, you know, Cambridge published, like, yeah, you know, I'm sure they got the telegraph dates right? Like, so I'd be making an automatic set of assumptions, or not automatic, but a relatively educated set of assumptions about which facts would have been distorted, what were the predictable distortions, and what information could I reliably take out of the secondary source, which is exactly what we do with primary sources all the time. But actually, one gets accustomed to doing that quite smoothly out of secondary sources as well. And part of this conversation is saying that, you know, doing that work with the getting to know a new historiography that is not necessarily a historiography that we've been trained in, to a degree, strongly enough or well enough, having read enough, having developed enough of a depth in that historiography that we can know what we're going to rely on and what we're not, and we can start taking information more smoothly out of it, is like real work. And I don't know of any shortcuts there. Well, I mean, sitting down with someone who's already an expert and confessing your utter ignorance. It's a useful shortcut, but it's not the only one.
No, related, I think one of the real challenges that with any of this kind of work is, and it's this quiet set of decisions that I think we all make, we don't usually reflect self-consciously about, is when you're going to stop reading, right? Like, you know, if we really take seriously that all of these different geographies of history have, you know, some depth that has some sort of infinite fractal character, right, where you could just plunge into it indefinitely, right? But realizing real practical constraints, right, and then how do you balance, I think some of it just comes down to self-awareness about where are the deep spots in your knowledge and where things get fuzzy, and relying on experts and kind of team-driven work to kind of help you make sure that you're being honest and kind of getting things right in whatever fields you're touching on. But I think that's a real challenge of trying to figure out how far to read in the secondary literature.
Yeah, I mean, this somewhat builds on what the conversation about how historians read, or this kind of. I mean, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of anxiety around historians' practice as such, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything comparable that the historical profession has gone through than, you know, the kind of epistemological kind of rounds that anthropology went through, or other, there's nothing like that, and the global doesn't produce a crisis. That might be something to think more about as to why it doesn't, or why, this kind of extraordinary absorptive capacity of what historians do. But, I mean, very, very broad brushstrokes. There is a way in which global history, at its most promising, interesting, represented a rearticulation of a relationship between a certain kind of social science, explanatory-driven sort of accounts, right? With the kind of cohesive narrative histories that Sam yesterday said that, we shouldn't forget that we want cohesive narratives and we want kind of persuasive narratives. So it's like that, to build on a phrase you used, Andrew mentioned you mentioned Latour. Yeah, right, and I was thinking, well, that's a little like Geertz's thick description, but a problem-driven thick description. So unlike social sciences, unlike, say, the old kind of historical sociology, I think one thing that historians, global and have going for them is also the capacity or the instinct or the dispositional habitus, if you will, to a trained habitus to think reflexively about the categories, their analytic categories, right? And I think this is what distinguishes, say, like if you say the work of some of the most critical people, say within IR theory versus Robert Vitalis, what he's doing, right, or what he does. And that's a distinction right there between or what you were doing with Marx, where Marx is not just some social theorist that if you're in a sociology department, you read a canon and you read Weber, you read Marx, but you know, what you don't do is historicize Marx's categories, and you don't historicize him as a, right? And I think this is what historians can do, is also not treat, quote, theory, treat it as a primary source, right? And I think because decolonize that relationship, right? Because there's a way in which, so I think too much under the sort of, if you will, anvil of the kind of social science mode of, a social theory canon, which is never itself historicized. And I think this is something we can learn from history of science more generally, not, we can agree to disagree on Latour, but and what they're doing. So I think that kind of work. So I think the work that, and also philosophers of science have been doing. You think of this incredible work that, it's not global, but they're doing. They have a kind of extraordinary, organic, affiliate between their objective analysis and how they're telling the story. I'm thinking of works like Objectivity by, Gallison and Daston. Like, that's an incredible piece of work, right? And it's taking very seriously this question of historical epistemology, and it is profoundly sort of ambitious and conceptually ambitious. And so I think that's another thing to think about, is that there wasn't a great deal on history of science, but I think that would be very interesting to think about, because they've been much more kind of oriented by, but not under the thraldom of a certain social science sort of explanatory kind of imperative, as it were. Yeah.
And I completely agree. I think with the idea about treating the theory as the necessity of treating the theory as a primary source, among other reasons, to avoid the Eurocentric problems of treating like Weber or Marx or Durkheim or whoever is the truth, and then we're going to apply this truth to raw material. Or Latour.
Of Chateau Latour.
Yeah. Obviously, but there are problems. But I think that the super flat model, that's what Latour does from, and you don't need Latour for super flat, but super flat is one of the things that Latour offers, and just an insistence that we're all part of it's all part of one big network. I don't like the network. The network is my least favorite part, but it's all part of one. There's no that you never get above. You're always in that level. And the one thing I wonder about is, like for me, I would have wanted to apply, use Marxism as a way to understand the Civil War regardless. And it just so happened that Marx is a character in the story. And then the Conjure is different. I had no idea I was going to come across Conjure, but then that becomes a way that I can also, think about history the way Conjure, I think, thinks about history too. But like that's just lucky that I happen to have theorists that I like that I want to use in my story, I think. But what if? There must be stories that don't have theorists that you want to. If I was writing about like Nazi Germany, would I? I'm thinking of an example like where I wouldn't want to use that theory to explain that history. Maybe I would look at anti-Nazi fighters, maybe at that point to understand them. And the Nazis are always kind of a cheap example. Anyway. But anyway, it's a problem. But I feel like it's fortuitous in my case. But I think I would like to do it from now on, is to have the theorists always be characters in the story. But I don't know if it's always possible.
Yeah, I think.
So may I suggest with an eye on the clock, I want to give you a chance.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Any questions? Yeah, Dr. Blue, please.
I'm thinking about the issue of scale from perhaps a slightly different perspective, or maybe, dare I use the word practical perspective. In my own work, I am trying to manage the multi-sided nature of my research of a network, perhaps 60 different small communities and large communities, to try to get at this meaning of solidarity across borders and in the Cold War. And I'm wondering, going back to something Paul asked earlier, how do you know when to stop? And I'm wondering if those of you who've been through multiple projects and multiple research sites, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you decide if you have this global or transnational history that continues to grow and grow and grow. How have you decided to draw some boundaries on that in ways that still allow it to be huge as networks or other kinds of historical engagements can be, but still be manageable and practical and financially feasible?
Can I actually piggyback like a PS onto Molly's question, which is, since this is a room full of early career researchers, can you talk a little bit about career stage as another kind of temporality that intersects with questions that you ask at different moments in your own travel through time?
I have like two brief answers to that. One, I didn't come here as a partisan of Latour, but so this is because Latour is also like, when do you stop tracing the networks? And his answer is when you run out of time. And I think that's one good answer. It's like, just think, I mean, especially if you're on like a tenure clock or something, then you have a very good sense of time that doesn't come from your project, it comes from somewhere else. But another, like the answer that I would give that's more true to the sources is, at some point in all my projects, there's become a point where there's these weird moments where like I'll come across, read a source that I haven't read yet, and it will confirm my argument. And it's like, oh my God, it's almost as if my argument was true. And when I have that, it's a really bizarre feeling, when that starts happening a lot, then I know it's done, So.
It's a weird take on the smoking head.
Yeah.
I'll jump in to say, for me, something that became quite useful, because of course, there will never be an organic reason to stop moving things outward, but I also was not comfortable with the idea that I was just going to let the contours of what I included or didn't include be sort of aleatoria, like random, driven by even while recognizing that of course it was going to be driven by circumstance, and it was like, like I was pregnant with baby number 3, I was not going to another country. So like that was a relevant truth of like labor history, but that was my labor history, not the labor history of the people I was writing about, and I wanted to keep those separate. So mapping for me was very helpful. I wanted to have some like externally accurate-ish things to hang my picture. So it's part of this spatial intentionality. So I started collecting census data, which you can do relatively easily. So I just started making a table and then having that made into a map with like numbers of, so I was studying British Caribbean migration around the Greater Caribbean. Numbers of British Caribbean immigrants in 1900 and 1930 in every single country I could find numbers for. And I sort of, along the way while doing other things, accumulated these numbers. And then I put them on a map, actually hired a cartographer to put them on a map. And so then I felt so much better about being able to tell stories about part of that. And then I started publishing like that map in almost any like journal article I write. I could throw like, and then I have like a slightly different one, and I throw that one in there because to me it's so helpful to be able to say, okay, this is a visual reminder that I'm telling the story of this like southeastern corner of the migratory system, and there are like 60,000 British Caribbeans in Cuba who I'm saying nothing about. Well, I'm still not saying anything about them, but at least I know that they're there. And I know that I need to be cognizant of the fact, and I need to be open and upfront about the fact that there's a piece of the story that you are not getting in this article for reasons, if I did put it into footnote, but I don't, would be like, I've got all these kids, I can't get visas to go to Cuba. That's not happening. Like literally, so like there's an immigration-related reason that Cuba does not appear in my research. It does not have to do with the immigration policies of the 1930s. It has to do with the immigration policies of the 2010s. But so finding a way of mapping something that allows me to point to where the unknowns are for me, it reduces some of the sense of pressure to cover everything, because you're never going to be able to cover everything.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, clearly there are these like institutional, practical, life cycle kind of constraints we all have to work within. I mean, I think another set of questions that I bring to bear on this question about when to stop and how densely to focus my reading in one area is to think both about implicitly how am I thinking about causation in this story? Like, in other words, what parts of the story am I assigning causal weight to, right? Or kind of, right? And I think that's, and that takes a lot of knowledge and research to get to that point where you can think about, okay, what are the main drivers of this story, right? And I think we all implicitly or explicitly have a sense of the centers of that and the places where, you know, causation becomes less central, less important, and we're building narratives that implicitly usually, you know, draw on different, you know, causal weights or causal force, right? And I think focusing our reading increasingly on those places, right? But at the same time, not letting it drop off immediately after that, right? Because part of what makes textured history is a sense that, yeah, there are some things that are really moving things, and then there are some things that are like putting a little bit of pressure on things, right? And you want those in there too, right? So, but in a way, making a pragmatic assessment about how much high resolution, in a way, to focus on your reading based on what are usually implicit, but which can be explicit emphases on yeah, and then that ultimately, you know, revolves on us in self-consciousness about our own theorizing, right? Because to understand how we're attributing cause means we're operating from some social theory, right? Or applying a certain set of concepts or presuppositions. So it involves a certain amount of self-reflexiveness. And then the other thing alongside the causal map that we're drawing, I think is a narrative question, which is about realism, which is about texture, which is about, we are trying to render past realities in prose, right? And to do that persuasively on the page requires a certain amount of texture, right? And so I think there's a certain, and I think that can intersect with the causal depth of our research, but sometimes it goes beyond it. Sometimes you just have to read enough in a field that you have a sense of how you can convey that reality as a writerly project. And I think that's something to keep in mind too in terms of where we focus our reading.
Yeah, let's maybe get like a bunch of questions together, right, in the interest of time. So, yeah, please.
I've been thinking about sort of what the impetus is that puts us all in this room, right? Like the idea that we have people who are doing transnational history, people who are falling under the sign of global history, these kinds of things. And it occurs to me one concept that we haven't really talked about yet is the idea of multi-directionality. And that's one of the things that kind of spurs us to do this work, is a kind of received sense that maybe comes from the way in which you know, a sort of post-colonial understanding is the air that we breathe, that things don't just come from the West and go everywhere else, right? They don't just come from the center and go to the periphery. That part of why we engage in these projects is the idea that everything doesn't just move in that one direction. And so I just wanted to ask you all to reflect on how multi-directionality is important in the stories that you're telling, and whether you think that that's a thing that ties together some of these issues.
Great, George.
I just like to make 2 points, and one of them actually sort of picks up on what Christy was just mentioned in terms of, I came here expecting to have lots of conversations about the kind of the global and the transnational and how useful these terms were, and then kind of on the train up I was thinking about, well, where do I kind of sit in terms of them, and I think it's been really liberating that we haven't been drawn into those conversations. And actually when one of the panels sat there and had quite a constructive discussion about the global, it was rather to look at it from a kind of perspective point of view. And I wonder whether we don't need to kind of hang on to these terms in the same way to kind of carve out our own place in the field.
Yes.
To the point where the kind of discussion that's gone on in front of us seems to me to be less about kind of the geographies of world history than just about kind of doing good history. And from that I'd like to pick up on both Manu and Lara made the point of looking more at what do we do well and how can we do more of that. And I think Manu's right to say that, you know, we can easily look at this as a kind of moment of anxiety, but actually while keeping an eye on the potential pitfalls of what we're doing, we should be embracing as well. And it's been really nice to come to a conference and kind of hear everyone talk a little bit briefly about their research and go away thinking, I really want to go and read that afterwards. So I think it's been a kind of confidence boosting and really kind of forward thinking exercise.
Yeah, real quick, please. Okay.
So Andrew, you you talked about 19th century narrative in history being like sort of stuck in this 19th century realist novel sort of mode. And I'm wondering how you think we should, I was just reading Matthias Enar's book Compass, which is this kind of fever dream about Orientalism, and it's really sort of unconventional narrative. I'm wondering how you think we sort of push unconventional narrative or storytelling forward in a discipline, especially for early researchers, where the peer review process is really liberal when it comes to theory, but when it comes to narrative, they're saying make it more concrete, and they sort of force you into that very sort of rigid, classic sort of narrative style.
Yeah, going back to Bill, on the first two of these comments or questions and thinking about the umbrella we all fit in and how we all speak to each other, one of the consistent things that's been coming up for me, the vibe I've gotten talking to various people about their projects here, is there's kind of like a band of misfits feeling to the gathering. And I love that, and I think that's where a lot of really interesting work happens. But I'm curious if there are, if there are now conferences where it's the Band of Misfits conference, are we no longer the misfits? And if that's the case, I'd love to hear your thoughts kind of more broadly about where this kind of work stands in the profession, in terms of its normality or the extent to which it's becoming more common. I mean, none of us want to say that we're inventing something new, obviously, as we've discussed.
Yeah, plenty there.
Yeah, I mean, this will pick up, Becca and Christy's questions. I mean, on the question of what directionalities we're thinking about, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about also as I'm listening to the various papers and trying to be self-conscious about my own work is to ask what globalism we're thinking with in this scholarship, because I feel like there's a way that in lots of different fields of history, as you're reading it, you can sense kind of what theorists the historian has been reading that are kind of providing the lenses onto this material. And I feel like one of the signs of a well-developed field is a kind of self-consciousness about that, right? Where the theory isn't necessarily foregrounded, but it's present and it's self-conscious, right? And so you can read, you can say like, this is a third wave feminist critique of this material, right? And I feel like actually there's a way that I'd like to see more of that in the field of self-consciously global history, because I think it would actually help sharpen some of the distinctions in this field. It would help us identify the sub-communities within this, right, in terms of this band of misfits idea. Because I feel like within a lot of the kind of what I think about the kind of more mainstream conversations about global history, there is a kind of operant social theory, which I think of as some variant of late 1990s enthusiasms about globalization, right? And a whole series of neoliberal metaphorics around connectivity, cosmopolitanism, right? A world coming into being through greater flows, right? And then those flows get laundry listed in a kind of apolitical way. Capital, information, people. Well, the people not so much, right? But this laundry list model, right? And we've all seen this in historical writing getting imported essentially from Thomas Friedman, right, into the kind of history. Speaking of flattening, right? And so, and what's interesting is to think about all the other alternative global approaches, right? Whether it's coming from post-colonialism, world systems theory, contemporary debates about ecological inequality, right? There's a whole series of other conceptual apparatuses and alternative globalisms that we can be building histories through and with, right? And I feel like that's a lot of the work that's been going on here, and it's part of what makes it so exciting. But I think in a way, registering that more self-consciously and sort of saying, let's evaluate history is not so much by whether we're doing the global or the transnational, but which global, right? Which set of lenses, which politics of the global is animating the work we're doing.
Just one's enough.
No, I completely and utterly agree with you that precisely because so much of global history has been kind of strategies of disciplinary legitimation, careerism, branding, and the like, and it is so bound up with also a certain kind of neoliberalism, and it's not always been clear where the epistemology of global history is in relation to that project, and it's been absolutely overdetermined by that. Some future historians will historicize the global turn in those ways, and it is, and it's clearly inflected by that. But going back to this misfits, I mean, there is a sense here, it seems, in the room, a lot of the projects about less another kind of globe than another world is possible, or another world history is possible, and I think there's that. And I think it's important then to think of these kind of older ways, which have been partly obscured, of trying to do certain kind of world-scaled analysis, so, world systems, etc., which is, also, I mean, as is well known, is a social science formation, but it takes off directly from Pan-Africanism, and it takes off from places like Dar es Salaam. So this is embedded in the history of the social sciences in the 20th century. So, so I think that's rather interesting. I think to understand its kind of durability is it's linked, because it's sort of, there's a real depth to the kind of histories that it comes out of itself. So I agree with you about this question of what sort of global. One of the things that I think would be interesting is to think about why there hasn't been more collaborative writing. And that would be something to think about. I mean, you're all going to buy each other's books also, which is also really great.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing that comes out of this. But
I'll jump in just briefly on the idea of multidirectionality to say I think that's functions really generatively just as a constant hypothesis, so that in any, which is to say that the default hypothesis now is if there's a recognized flow of influence in one direction, there's probably something that we could be paying attention to but haven't for ideological reasons that push back against that. There might not be. Like as an empirical question, there might or might not be, but if we don't look for it, we're not going to see it. And when you have a sort of ideologically overdetermined framework that has masked certain kinds of influence or connection or power functions, so A as a hypothesis, like always look against the grain of larger border crossing connections, and then a second hypothesis as a sort of technique of looking would be to say maybe there's always a vernacular theory. Yeah. It's not always going to be super useful, but precisely because people are always, we are all of us making sense from different subject positions and different geopolitical positions of the world in which we're living at the moment that we're living it. So pushing, going at like the extra mile in thinking about, and in some ways sort of parallel to the multidirectionality, as a hypothesis, there's someone whose voice wasn't loud enough to make it into the academy, or loud enough to make it into the canon, who had a really different perspective on this that was really acute. So sooner, let's work from the head, rather than assuming that we're not likely to find it, so why bother? Let's assume that somewhere in my sources, someone was articulating in a way that should have been visible to me, a vernacular theory of the world that they lived in.
And starting with that, I think, is really, really important. I mean, thinking about like the band of misfits, it's also a comment. I mean, we could be studying also bands of misfits too, ideally, like the people, and that, I mean, that's, relates to a lot of, like Christy's point too, about it. It's like just not being Eurocentric is already like the first, maybe the most important step. Probably the word global, part of it's that used, in old-fashioned history departments, like, and many still today, there's like the US and Europe and global are like the three areas. And so, I mean, that was my department until like just 2 years ago. And of course one wants to be the global there, and not because you want to study the whole world. And even if you're studying like the US or Europe, you still want to be the global in that, if you have to choose of those three. And so, I mean, that makes me think about like this question of, the misfits part and what's good about, I mean, I like the term transnational a lot, but with an accent on the trans rather than on the national. Because I mean, we can all, at any point, we can always look to like, what are the democratic emancipatory struggles that are happening at the moment we're studying, but also in the moment that we're studying right now. And I think it's pretty clear that like the movement towards like a more transpositive understanding of gender, for example, is among many things that are going on, one of the most interesting and progressive and important democratic struggles. And so what can we learn, without appropriating other people's struggles, but what can we learn from those struggles? And thinking about the trans and the transnational, with the national as an afterthought rather than vice versa, I think is interesting for me anyway, and I think maybe one way to think about what we're doing. The question about like how to write, like, I think just thinking about the writing, I think the peer review question makes things very difficult though, because the peer reviewers are in some sense they're ensuring that the tradition gets reproduced mostly. And that's an important function of it, right? But they also can have a conservative effect on these things. So I find I've had a lot of difficulty publishing stuff on conjure because, probably because I'm just choosing the wrong journals, but they'll say, I'm convinced, they say, I don't see anything wrong with what you're saying, but I'm not convinced. Or when I've written, and the same thing with my writing I've written about Max Weber and his racism, which is quite explicit, but again, that's not, I didn't have trouble getting that published, but still a lot of people will say, I can't disagree with anything you're saying, except I don't believe it. And that's obviously, there's a lot that happens in peer review, but part of it has a real conservative intent, I think, also, as well as function. And it's not, I definitely wouldn't say we should give up peer review, but that's something that constrains how we can write and what we can write about.
Which in a way kind of brings us back to our discussion of the pessimism of the intellect.
Yeah.
But hopefully the hint of optimism can be followed up with more questions on a pint of beer. Because we do need to, I think, conclude our session. So please join me thanking our keynote.